if the bank alone was whack is you're paying your taxes, allows these Wall Street asses to foreclose your home. They spit in your face and they don't even know you're doing all kinds of fine lines of uncut blow. In the corner office sitting on a toilet of gold, they all getting down with the most expensivist hoes, drinking Cristal from a tap water to go. Well, you all work harder, it's a non-starter. You gotta fight the greasy bums that you all love and know. In Congress playing dumbless, they all be eating crow at the ballot box, cause many Congress people on the slide getting big bennies from the people on the do 5 to 20, while we all buying food with a few pennies. You got problems and you know there are too many.
The people on the 24-hour news networks and people in Congress are both justifying having the very people who caused the credit crisis stay on in the Obama administration. They're doing this in the following way. They're saying that the credit crisis is like a complex time bomb that these people engineered, and since they're the only people who know how it was built, they're the only people who can defuse it. That's what's known as a false representation. The credit crisis is not a time bomb. That would imply the following. 1. That the economy is a highly structured, highly ordered entity rather than an amorphous sea of contradictory inputs. 2. That the credit crisis was somehow engineered on purpose rather than the short-sighted greed of a few douchebags. 3. Assuming that the previous is true and the credit crisis was engineered on purpose, for whatever reason, the people who engineered it are now willing to do the right thing. First, let's talk about Timothy Geithner. Geithner is a professional economic hitman. He worked for the IMF doing policy development. What is the IMF? The IMF is an organization that lends money to developing nations that have no way of ever possibly paying back their debts. As a bargaining tool, the IMF then pressures the developing nation to sell off natural resource rights to multinational corporations, including subsidiaries of the banks that lent them the money in the first place. Of course, without control over their own natural resources, these nations soon find it impossible to ever generate the wealth they need in order to pay back their debts, and soon become indentured to the IMF, the banks backing it, and the multinational corporations that move in to use their natural resources. They also usually end up losing control over the ability to make laws to protect their environment and their citizens from pollution and abuse, lest the IMF and its banks call in their debt. It's kind of like corporate colonialism, except that instead of moving a population into the area to settle, they're just taking indirect control of the government and the natural resources. From the Merriam-Webster Dictionary, imperialism, the policy, practice, or advocacy of extending the power and dominion of a nation, especially by gaining indirect control over the political and/or economic life. Right, so anyways, Timothy Geithner also worked under Henry Paulson, who worked as Treasury Secretary under George W. Bush. Timothy Geithner also worked as president of the New York Federal Reserve Bank. For those of you who aren't familiar with American monetary policy, the Federal Reserve and the Treasury are two separate entities. The Federal Reserve is a cabal of private banks from which the Treasury borrows credit to print money, and then ends up owing interest back to that cabal of private banks on the money that's printed. It was ostensibly created to free up credit during the crisis of the Great Depression. Sound familiar? The problem with the Federal Reserve is that we don't need private banks to issue our Treasury credit. The Treasury already has the constitutional authority to print currency and to back that currency with credit by the power of fiat, a Latin term meaning it is so because I say it is so. The reason why the Treasury borrows credit from this cabal of private banks is because the bankers used the crisis of the Great Depression to capitalize and to sneak legislation through the Congress that allowed them to make a lot of money for a long time. And they're doing it again. Geithner and Paulson also worked for Goldman Sachs, a private bank. And since Geithner and Paulson were the ones who engineered the bailout, most of the money has gone to, surprise, Goldman Sachs, and not to other institutions like Lehman Brothers, even though both banks were equally fucked financially. The bankers on Wall Street were not building a time bomb, but were simply following short-sighted greed. They knew that the international pool of money was looking for new financial products to invest in, and they were desperate to come up with these new products. Products such as the mortgage-backed security. With a mortgage, as you may know, the bank lends you a sum of money, and then you pay back that sum of money over time, plus interest. Mortgages can be pretty usurious, with as much as 80% of the money paid over the life of the mortgage going to interest alone. But mortgages are an evil that we all seem to have accepted. From a long-term perspective, and from the bank's perspective, they're very secure financially, with the borrower paying back far more than they were lent in the first place, over a period of 20, 30, or 40 years. How the mortgage-backed securities worked, more or less, was that mortgages were bundled together and then sold to investors. The investors then held these mortgage-backed securities and received the payments from the mortgage holders. So long as the mortgage payments were being paid, the investors would make money. But then the banks decided to get greedy. After the pool of available mortgages they had to sell to the international pool of money dried up, they had to find new things to sell. So they decided to make mortgages more available, and they decided to lower their standards. Since they weren't the ones who were collecting on the mortgages, they didn't have to worry about people being able to pay them back. And they didn't care if the global pool of money ended up holding the short end of a shit stick. It was no longer in the bank's interest financially to find secure borrowers to lend to. Rather, it was more important to find more people to lend to so that they could bundle these and sell them. Buyer beware, right? The worst part of the crisis is that real people are really losing their homes because of this credit crisis. Property value has decreased dramatically since the original mortgage was lent, and so the property value is nowhere near what the original amount lent was. This inability of the banks to break even on what they lent out is a big reason why these banks are asking for a bailout. The big problem with this is that the bailout floats these banks financially so that they're able to stay in business while they foreclose on people's homes. If the bailout hadn't been given and these banks collapsed, the mortgages that they held would simply vanish and people would be allowed to keep their homes, as they wouldn't owe the money to a bank that doesn't exist. To add to the mess, we also had practices within the hedge fund community on Wall Street, such as short selling. This financial tool is used as a sort of insurance policy against any stocks that you have. One problem is, though, you don't need to own a stock that you're trying to short sell. It's kind of like you're taking out an insurance policy on a house down at the end of the block. And also everybody else on the block is also taking out an insurance policy on that house. And you're all hoping it'll burn down so you can cash in. Actually, it's less like an insurance policy and more like playing roulette, putting all your money on black and hoping you'll win. So some economic geniuses decided that they could take bets on stocks that they didn't own. So they collected a bunch of money with the idea that in the short term they could make out like bandits, which they did. Then they turned around and used the money they'd collected from other people who were short selling stocks to go ahead and short sell stocks themselves. And then the people that they short sold also used the money that they collected to turn around and short sell other stocks. And so on, until you reached a crescendo of clusterfuck, in which everybody was pretending to have money that they didn't actually have in order to pay back other people for an insurance policy they were willing to sell. This was good in the short term as it generated all sorts of new wealth on paper, and we were all partying with money on the books that didn't really exist. When stocks started falling and people had to start paying out, the whole thing fell apart. Suddenly, they had to pay out money that they were only pretending that they had in the first place. Oh yeah, that's another thing. $11 trillion vanished overnight as if it never existed. Why is that, you ask? Well, it's because it never existed. How quaint. So to recap, the credit crisis we're in is not a time bomb at all, but more like a gigantic pile of bullshit that's collapsed under its own weight. And the pundits are all saying that we need the people who engineered this crisis because they're the only ones who understand shit stacking.
Knick, knack, paddywhack, if the bank alone with whack is you're paying your taxes, allows us Wall Street asses to foreclose your home. They spit in your face and they don't even know you're doing all kinds of fine lines of uncut flow in the corner office sitting on a toilet of coke.